Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anne Sraders. I'm a senior reporter at Sifted, and I'm going to turn it to my panel to briefly introduce themselves. Nicola, let's start with you.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everybody. So my name is Nicola Sinclair. I'm general partner at Twin Track Ventures, and we're backing companies that can serve both commercial and defence and security customers.
And hey, I'm Pekka Laurila, Chief of Strategy at ICEYE. You heard the ICEYE intro already,
I think most of us saw the ICEYE advertisement at the airport saying that you guys defend Europe from space. So it's a good start. I want to start with you, Nicola, and sort of set the scene for all of us. I guess from your perspective, why are you interested in dual use compared to pure defense? And maybe talk a little bit about how you differentiate that from an investment thesis perspective.
Sure. For me personally, it came out of some experience early on. About 7 years ago, I ran a fund inside defence and security in the UK. And we started off looking at dual-use companies, but some of those, we didn't even have the word dual-use at the time. Some of those were really much more defence first, or really defence companies where at a component level there was an opportunity to be dual-use. And I just summarise by saying that was quite a hard journey. What I saw, even from the inside, where I was able to put companies on contract, was that the cycle with the buyer was just so difficult. For me, it's not about kind of changing the perception or the ethics of the company. It's about the practical reality of what it's like selling and working into defence and really trying to grow and scale without being reliant on government spending.
And Pekka, from your perspective, I know ICEYE was started many years ago, but recently you guys have been increasingly leaning into working with defense customers and government customers. So how did you guys come to sort of the perspective of wanting to push more into those types of customers? How did that conversation evolve about maybe what boundaries you would have within that process?
Yeah, so if you think of the sort of like the type of system that we're trying to build, of course, it's multi-use, and then the sort of like the defense use always, of course, has been there, and now, if you think of the adoption cycle of going from academia to defense to large industries to agriculture to consumers somewhere far down the line, I think right now it just is that the technology that we have and the need and the ability to procure and get value out of it. Right now is the moment of defense in terms of that long track of the adoption cycle is there, and then in that sense it's showing very strongly that majority of the business that ICEYE does today is in defense. Maybe for the very practical reason that that is the place where kind of the maturity of the technology and the need of the market, they meet there right now very heavily.
In terms of that split of business, you said the majority of your business comes from defense at the moment. How do you think about the most sustainable business model moving forward? Because Nicola, I know you sort of said in the past as well that from your perspective, it makes more sense for startups to have additional commercial streams of revenue. So Pekka, how did you guys think about long-term, what is the business model?
Yeah, of course, ICEYE is now a 10-year-old company or a little bit more that ICEYE in a startup configuration, of course, the first customer that you go to doesn't tend to be defense for the pragmatic reason that then there are gigantic programs and then you have to go through the procurement cycle, and traditionally the procurement cycles in major defense programs would have been 4 + 4 + 4 years, and then as a startup that's not the time scale that you're dealing with. So actually ICEYE's very first customer was the world's largest company back then, ExxonMobil, which is has very similar needs of understanding what's happening around you when you're doing operations, out in the sea, and then we had shipping companies, we had insurance companies, so kind of made smaller starts into something that is a that is also the future use case. All of those things we do intend to do in large scale, but again when you take it back into something that right now. The true scale of business is in the defense, but we have a relatively large business in insurance right now, for instance, as well. And it's this sort of thing where you do this kind of a little bit, couple more years forward investments into, also opening up the markets kind of deeper down the line. So maybe we are a little bit different company in this question from the point of view that a lot of the thinking that we now start to do is the sort of 3, 5, 10-year horizons, and that's not, of course, a thing that the startup starts with.
Nicola, I mean, you talk to pretty early stage founders. How do you talk to them about when they're thinking through their strategy, how they should plan around, going after defense customers versus maybe other types of commercial customers?
Yeah, so I do deep tech, pre-seed and seed. And for me, the thing is often to say, why do you care about defense? Like, what do you think you're going to get out of that relationship? I mean, to Pekka's point about procurement and how difficult that can be, I think it is really important to recognize that you're meeting the buyer where they are today. There's so much talk about reform in defense, but we've been talking about that for a really long time. And some of those changes have started, but they're still more a headline than they are a practical reality at the contracting level. So what I often look for is for companies that want a reference customer. I think one of the features of deep tech is that technology can sound too good to be true. I think it can make your first customer in the commercial sector quite nervous. It sounds like, will I personally get some blowback for believing in Jack and the Beanstalk sort of ideas? But if you can go to them and say, look, we've had a small project with defense and security, they're willing to talk to you, you can see some data around the user experience and the impact it's had. So I'm really looking for technologies that aren't just applied in defense, but that are more fundamental. Actually, what I've seen is there's a huge catalyzing effect on that commercial conversion timeline with that first commercial customer. They're not bothered about being the first commercial customer, they're bothered about being the first customer. And so I think that's a really useful way of thinking about a wider type of opportunity in defence. It doesn't have to be about procurement. If you have a relevance in the sector, you can consider what does this look like as a reference customer relationship.
And Nicola, I know, we've spoken about this before, and I think this is a key question that a lot of VCs think about right now when they're considering investing in defense or dual use is, the exit market, what happens, who's going to buy my startup? Is it one of the big defense primes? Will they go public? How do you think about that sort of future exit when you're talking to young startups looking in this space? And maybe Pekka, if you also have anything to add as well. But let's start with you really quick.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing that we're definitely seeing is that the exits is quite a spread in terms of what does that mean. But to try and keep it relatively simple, for me, you're considering a multiple, and the multiple in the defence sector is maybe not great, even if you're looking at an exit to a neo-prime. That might work if you're an angel investor in a defence company, but it's probably not going to work if you're a fund investor. So I think very carefully about that number and the realism. But what I tend to then look at is, what does this mean in their market? So for me, I'm looking for companies to maybe do something like 20% of their future revenue defence and security. So the emphasis is very strongly on commercial.
Okay.
So I'm really thinking about it probably more like a regular deep tech VC, but it's that early supercharge from working with defence and security. And of course, if you can make it competitive between two buyers in two different sectors, fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess something like medical technology would be like an example of an even worse sort of an industry from the point of view of you have to go these like incredibly long cycles before you're able to run in a way like on your own, if you will, as sort of like so building like a kind of next world leader in a medical tech would be even harder than building it in the defense tech. As far as what ICEYE is trying to do is, we're certainly trying to build, this not as an exit story, but like, a story where the defense industry in a way plays the similar role where, imagine GPS in year 85, that is the first industry that gains value out of, having access to this type of technology. And then, whether the adoption cycle is 5, 10, or 15 years, like this is hard to tell, but like, eventually the aim is to grow to that scale.
Now, Pekka, I want to talk about something that we actually discussed prior to the panel, is that you mentioned that, if right now, considering the current market cycle and the defense hype that we're in, if you as a startup don't lean heavily into defense and AI as a story for investors, you're missing out on, you said 10x the valuation. I'm curious, I guess, if you can speak a bit more to that, and I guess how young founders should be thinking about pitching themselves in the right way, but also making sure they're not just, tagging on to the hype.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I would come back to the same thing about this kind of like, of course, there are a lot of different types of companies, but when you go to like, tech and kind of specifically deep tech companies, whether it's you're building, fusion reactors or you're building kind of medtech or you're building, space technology or quantum computing or something like this, then like, just being relatively honest to yourself that like, the adoption cycle is going to be long, and unless you have like an incredibly large capital pool behind you, then you are going to have to do business during the time, to actually like make it to the scale that like is going to be the sort of like worldwide adoption scale for a thing like this. And then all of those deep tech areas, like in the end, typically somewhere in the governmental defense, sectors, the sort of first major product market fit, if you will, or the technology to use case fit, it tends to be there. And then sort of, if you're not gonna, do that part, then you better have like a really good story on like how you're gonna jump over that part, which will mean that, you will have to have this much deeper, capital pockets to do it. And like you're talking, not hundreds of millions, you're talking like billions and billions of capital in between.
I mean, I guess in terms of those conversations with investors, is there a premium right now, do you think, with defense? No, I think, maybe, just like the thing that is maybe seen as a kind of paradigm shift, if you will, that like, will cause an investor to consider kind of like the defense opportunity a little bit differently is that, because of the last couple of years, the governments like actually have changed the way how the procurement thing works. So like, it would not necessarily have been realistic for you to say like, I'm going to be doing my first, commercial use cases, in defense before, not because the value wouldn't have been there. It's just that like the procurement would not. It's like it would not have turned that to revenue. But now since that's the paradigm shift that like is actually allowing for governments, even the smaller European governments, to go ahead and like act rapidly and be the early adopters. Then that of course gives maybe like a new boost to the sort of like early startup story of like, I will be able to offer this and I will actually be able to validate this and I will be able to do that also including the revenue in the cycle, and that might previously not have been possible. Okay. Before we move on, Pekka, I do have to ask, I saw some reports that you guys are fundraising at, I think, a 2.5 billion valuation. I got to put you on the spot and ask if you can comment at all on that. I will not. Okay, fair enough. Nicola, I guess about you, I am curious, I guess, from your perspective as well, are you noticing a lot of companies coming to you who maybe before weren't highlighting defense as much, but now are when they're pitching you? Or I guess how do you sort through the hype, I guess, when you're looking into companies? Yeah, sure. I mean, because personally I have a defense background, so I was in the military for 20 years and wore that uniform, I tend to get grouped in with defense funds and defense first funds. And so actually the call is almost in the other way around. I'm often really trying to diligence and make sure there is truly a dual use opportunity here. I mean, actually I don't use the phrase you use. I think it's quite problematic. It's a bit like the word innovation. It means so many different things and causes a misunderstanding quite a lot of the time. But no, I think one of the biggest changes for me, alongside what we've talked about with procurement, is the number of founders who are interested in building in the space are more alert to the fact that their technology may have an application, an early application in the sector. So they do come, they're willing to discuss what that might look like, but sometimes they're not really able to articulate, like, what's the wider impact? This sort of hammer looking for a nail issue. Because I think one of the interesting things about defense is it's a here and now market, potentially, for something that's maybe materializing longer term. It's a small market now for a much bigger company, for example, in maybe robotics or another sector like that. And so trying to separate out those ideas with the founder can be quite a challenge. Pekka, from your experience sort of getting those relationships with government and getting those contracts, can you kind of talk a little bit about maybe how that got started, what challenges you guys face working with governments, and maybe how young founders in the audience might need to prepare themselves for working with government customers? I think there's a lot of locality to it in a way that like isn't necessarily like, I mean, for sure, like if you're doing a consumer business,
like today's internet is the same internet in the entire Western world, and you know, you'll more or less kind of understand the dynamics, you know, as it is in the defense, especially in the kind of very early stage, you know, when it's about kind of like, you know, winning that first program, or, you know, getting into, you know, delivering, you know, or trialing or demoing something. Like every single, you know, country, you know, is their own thing. Some of those structures, like, you know, if you think of like the NATO's Diana programs and something like this, like there are, you know, emerging some sort of relatively, you know, good vehicles, you know, to, you know, do almost kind of accelerator style things, you know, with visibility into broader markets. And then I think like those are good and relatively fresh things, like, you know, when we were starting, those things did not really exist. So I mean, I think like looking into something like this is a good advice, I think I would say. And then, you know, the second thing, you know, being exactly that, like ultimately, maybe a sort of good thing to understand is that typically, like, you know, even a small country's defense force isn't a monolithic thing. That like ultimately you're going to find the users in the field having very different opinions and very different needs. And so if you go kind of like in from, you know, the user segment that you choose an individual, you know, nowadays, like when, you know, companies go to Ukraine to work, like they choose like, I'm going to be working with this company, like not this division, not this, you know, army group, like, you know, like this specific company or this specific platoon, like, you know, to go ahead and, you know, test and demonstrate. So like you go in very kind of low echelon into the field. Like if you want to get kind of quickest customer feedback, that's going to be the way. And probably the slowest ever customer feedback is going to be by kind of, you know, going in from like a procurement vehicle or kind of like a technology research vehicle in a military. So kind of pretty bravely going in kind of like, you know, towards the real end user, you know, and then, you know, the locality comes in as a challenge there, of course, because it's about like relationship building that, you know, they're not typically used to kind of being approached, but like quite often, you know, they will be able to talk to you.
Has it become easier to get their attention as a startup? I guess, as you said, you guys are about 10 years old now, so you're not quite as young as maybe some other companies looking to
so when
governance.
You arrive to an exercise with like, you know, 50 satellites under your back, you know, it's just like, yeah, you get attention in a different way than like, of course, you know, just, you know, coming in with a laptop and a demo. But I think it's fair to say that like, you know, the generally, you know, now in the armed forces that like, you know, I've been interacting with, you know, this like the vibe shift, if you will, of understanding that like, hey, the warfare is changing in such a rapid pace that like sometimes it's not even worth to invest into, you know, the technologies or the products being developed by this team, but like just the fact that like in my local ecosystem there are good teams and good industry that is able to innovate very rapidly is going to be the thing that is going to kind of make you win or lose the war. So the willingness to let's say lean in, you know, to things that like, you know, you're not even actually evaluating whether you're going to buy that stuff, but you know, you're like, you know, but these militaries, they're leaning into the idea of like, we really need these types of teams to be working in close collaboration with the armed force because we're going to need these teams. So like, you know, a couple of these angles, they have really changed over the, you know, just the last year. Yeah.
I'd love to jump in on that actually as well, because I completely agree with you. I feel like a few years ago, maybe 7 to 10 years ago, people were saying there's no front door. Now we've almost got the opposite problem. There are lots of front doors. And then they would talk about this thing called the Valley of Death, where there was no money inside defence to take you from like a basic level of technology through to a more mature, procurable level of technology. I think venture capital has started to really help actually close that gap too. What I'm starting to see with the founding community is that now there's this emphasis on partnership, that the way people are starting to deal with the issues in the procurement system is through partnering with other startups, changing the nature of the relationship with the partnership with primes, and now trying to resolve that last bit of the relationship. So it's an interesting shift because it's starting to change the nature of the difficulty in the sector more towards now how do you assess as a fund, as a founder, like what does partnership risk look like?
Well, Nicola, I know obviously you spent nearly 20 years in the UK Air Force, but from your perspective with helping startups now get into these spaces, what do you think governments want to see from startups? What are they looking for? What's important to them based on your understanding? And Pekka, maybe if you want to jump in with
I mean, they're still talking about we need more innovation, and hopefully from what we've just talked about, actually, I don't think that's necessarily the problem. They need some way of managing their pipeline. So it feels like they're a kind of very early stage VC. They've never worked at a fund before. They're completely overwhelmed now by all these interesting opportunities. And so I think it's like related to your point, Pekka, about you need advocacy inside the system. If you've done some exercises with a key user where the government really cares about that unit or that area of functioning because it's critical for their defence capability, that's now really starting to help have that internal advocacy turning into like a contract and converting. So I think there is a stage here where things are really starting to shift and develop. I mean, maybe you're seeing that too.
Yeah, maybe more or less, the same as I, just said previously. Like, I mean, it's fair to say that there is change, and I think, like, we've seen, this kind of pipeline management at least raised as a kind of a fundamental question that, like, I've sat in groups where, the Finnish military, has asked exactly this question, like. We know that there's a lot of technology. We know that, like, we would want there to be more. We know that there's a lot of smart people able to, start new teams that are going to be delivering, if not the critical piece today, then the critical piece, next year. We will have to be able to somehow scale the pipeline, and then it really becomes this that, like, where do you want to put the bottleneck? That you don't want to make it like this. That every military base out there, or like every unit, go ahead and like start your own sourcing program and your own accelerators, but like it also like isn't by any means obvious that like the answer is that like let's set up just one in the very top, because like just the way how this sort of echelon like organizations work is that in the bottom of the pyramid there is the most people, and then if you're trying to like actually access scale, then that's where your biggest scale is, and then you can see that in the top of the pyramid your bottleneck is there because this is the most narrow. So I think there's a lot to this, that like how do you like distribute that pipeline management enough, but not too much so that it gets diluted, and maybe there isn't a perfect solution.
I don't think so. I kind of think it's a bit like a fight club, actually. In the UK military, we used to say we've got 1,000 flowers blooming, none of them are reaching scale. They tried to make it super hierarchical, and now arguably we have like no flowers. So I think like some disorganization, and not necessarily duplication, but like some options are actually like it's worth it. It's a feature, not a bug.
I'd be curious to hear from both of you. What advice would you have for founders who have an idea that works as dual use and they're going out to pitch investors? What should they keep in mind? What should they bring up? What's important from your perspective as an investor, and Pekka, from your perspective in this industry to kind of work towards or pursue?
Yeah, I think it's maybe dependent slightly by sector, but in general, I like to see that people have done some thinking through of like, what is this technology actually like at its core best suited, and have they done some proper research? So sometimes, and it definitely comes up in the drone space, they bring something, there's an opportunity for dual use, but you look at it and you think, I'm not sure actually that just because this could be used in defence and security, actually it's a very good idea. And I think like really thinking through the reality. I think for a lot of Europe, we've been very lucky in this generation to grow up in a very secure and stable Europe until quite recently. And so for a lot of people, the reality of warfare is maybe what they've seen in films and movies. And so speaking to people, doing some networking, and really understanding what your technology might end up being involved in before you start to commit to the sector.
Yeah, I mean, so the advice, like to companies like drones and this type of sort of like like dual use leaning on defense tech, like a good pragmatic advice would be that if you're thinking of creating, say, a drone product, like if you have not deployed that in Ukraine, like I mean don't bother go to an investor because there's only one place where the real defense efficacy of something is being measured, and it's on the battlefield. And then that puts you exactly immediately into that super sobering question is that when the war is going on over there, I am looking at imagery of stuff being targeted and exploded, and it's not immediately obvious that that's for everybody, and by no means it's something that all high tech should be used for things like this, but I think if previously the sort of area of defense has been an area where ultimately it's about sort of politics and procurement without really heavy consideration of does this work, because you literally can't test it. Now we're in this little bit of an opposite problem of that it's not going to work if you can't test it, and for you to test it, it means that it's out there fighting a war.
We only have a couple minutes left, but clearly defense has become a huge topic across Europe. And my understanding is this is the first defense dual-use panel that Slush has ever had. So certainly this is a big thing that people are discussing. But I guess I'm curious to hear from both of you. Do you think defense is overhyped in the startup community right now? Nicola?
Yeah, I think I meet a lot of investors who are like, we do defense now. I'm like, okay, great. What are your subsectors? And they just kind of repeat the word defense. So I think a lot of places, this is not going to look very even. I think certainly, personally, I don't do drone hardware. I think that is a very different environment to potentially, for example, some of the interesting machine learning applications we're seeing, certainly in space, definitely in cyber. There's some materials, there's some really, really interesting sectors that are not behaving like defense. And for me, the longevity in those and the opportunity in those is very different to, for example, in drone hardware.
Pekka, how about you?
I'll have to repeat the question.
Do you think defense is overhyped right now?
I think for the sort of importance of it, it's not. If you think of defense of Europe as incredibly shitty as it is, it is going to be really, really important, and you cannot overstress that as far as public discourse, it is underhyped from the point of view of should we invest in defending Europe? We really should, and we should be investing more. Now, of course, to the point of that doesn't mean that every startup that has a defense application should even consider going there, and let alone be funded. So that it is a game where, of course, a certain scale is needed for you to have ability to deliver kind of real, meaningful performance and impact. So in that sense, probably there are areas where a very small startup scene, it may be a little bit overhyped. But then, as far as, going to the bigger scale, should we invest more? We really should.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you.